Hello there. This is Scott Lay, and this is another episode of Nooner Conversations. Today I sat down with Mike Madrid, Republican political consultant, a guy that's no stranger. I've known him since 1993 or so, back in community college days, and he's still the good Republican Mikey that I've known all along. Although, if you follow him, his tone has changed a little bit this year as it pertains to President Trump and his friends. We talk about some of that. We talk about the Lincoln Project, but we start out by talking about the protests related to the George Floyd death at the hands of police in Minneapolis, the protests that followed, and how that affects the November election. What might come out of Congress as the House and Senate each draft up their own plans for police reform, and the White House kind of stakes out its territory. And then we add into what becomes a Venn diagram the continuing COVID-19 crisis, which even amidst the reopening of many public amenities and businesses here in Sacramento and the surrounding counties. On Friday, we're going to see the reopening of movie theaters, bars, gyms, day camps, a panoply of public accommodations. And public health experts are fearing this. Political experts or political politicians and their advisors are going with what they think is necessary to preserve their livelihood, and that is to get the economy back running again. However, the public voters in all polling, both California and nationally, suggest that either the restrictions, the public activity restrictions that existed in mid-May should either be continued or even strengthened. Meanwhile, politicians are on a different track. We saw in Orange County the public health director this week resign amidst criticism by the Board of Supervisors for her mask ordinance. Even though things like that are generally poll well, except at the extremes. So we talk about that, the Venn diagram of protests related to policing and COVID-19, how that affects November, as well as the practical changes in November. It's going to be an all vote by mail ballot with vote centers. We saw problems with that this week in several states. And it also could be another election like we saw on May 12th in the special elections, whereby where it's under a stay-at-home order, meaning you can't canvass door by door to encourage voter turnout, or in the critics' parlance, to vote harvest, meaning picking up absentee ballots that have been completed, signed, and sealed to then transport to the registrar of voters. We also talk about how long the counting is going to take in November. We may not know the winners of the November 3rd election until after Christmas. That's a very real possibility once you consider social distancing required in the tabulation areas where they're going to be opening up and verifying the signatures of all 12 million plus vote by mail ballots that are going to be coming in the mail to county clerk's offices. We also talk about the congressional races in California, looking at the generic congressional ballot advantage Democrats currently have in national polling, and the likelihood that Republicans can pick up some of those 7 seats that they lost to Democrats in 2018. And then we talk about the president, and the president obviously comes up throughout this conversation, but specifically we talk about the Lincoln Project that Mike, along with 6 other Republican political consultants, have mobilized to challenge President Trump's reelection, as well as the senators that have supported President Trump's policies, nominees, that sort of thing. I think it was a great conversation. If you're a political animal, this one's for you. Sometimes it's about policy. This one's pretty much all politics. And I think it was a great conversation. It's the kind of conversation I'd want to have sitting with Mikey over lunch. So enjoy, and thank you for listening to Nooner Conversations. Hey, welcome, my good friend Mike Madrid. Welcome back to another Nooner Conversation.
Great to be with you. Yeah, it's been a while. It's been a little while.
It's been a little while. We've been in quarantine and lockdown in our bunker. We were inspecting our bunkers, I think.
Last time we did this, we were in person, I think, right? Having coffee, so it's a little bit different.
I think we were over at Chicory, which is closed now. We're waiting for Paul Mitchell, who got stuck in Solano County in traffic. But there's nothing really going on right now. So, but I thought I'd just touch bases with you to see if you might know of anything going on. But in all seriousness, I've known you for, I forgot, we counted it up. It was like 26, 27 years now. This is unlike anything we've ever seen with, this Venn diagram of different crises, and it all affects the politics and the election this year. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. But first, I want to start off by asking for your reaction to the protests over the last couple of weeks over the death of George Floyd, and what it means to you personally as a Latino, and also what it means for the politics that we have in 2020.
So, I mean, look, let me start by saying, one of the reasons I got involved in politics was, you recall the age that we were both at in 1992 during the Rodney King riots, is there was this striking sense that there was something very fundamentally wrong with the way our society worked and didn't work. And I don't want to say that was the only calling for me, but it was a very significant one. I've been writing quite a bit on the whole idea of the examination of race and identity in the country, especially lately, as we've taken this new added look at it in kind of the Trump era, but also because of what I call the Latinization of America. I've written a lot about this, about white protests and white anger and the decline of white America and what that means for Americanness while Latinos are on the rise, and how that all interplays with our original sin of slavery and the black-white construct through which Americans talk about race. Look, I don't want to say anything that would take away at all from what we really do need to focus on, which is the idea and the pain and the anger and the justified rage of Black Americans to finally have a place to be heard. And I say that with obviously some trepidation, because we've said that many times in our 250-year history, but things are foundationally and fundamentally different this time. And they're different. You can see it in public opinion polls overwhelmingly, where people are supportive. White people specifically are far more supportive now of the protests, obviously the peaceful protests that are being held throughout the world at this time, because I think Americans are just kind of sick and tired of being sick and tired of ignoring what they know is so foundationally and fundamentally wrong. And
let me ask you. I went over across the street on Sunday. There was the Black and Brown rally where the two groups were coming together, and that's been a controversial issue where some members of the Black community fear kind of doing a coalition approach on civil rights and wanting to have the distinct Black Lives Matter approach. Now, Sunday it was great to see the two groups together and mixing up Spanish and English, and having representatives of all different communities, including the Native community. But that is an ongoing tension, and I think we've seen it over the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a tension, and will continue to be as America transforms. America's not changing in its diversity numbers because of the rise of Black Americans. Blacks have been about 12% of the nation's population since the end of World War II, and that hasn't changed. What has changed is the Latino population. But to your point, I'm a firm believer that this moment requires a legitimacy of the Black Lives Matter movement. And by legitimacy, I mean, I think that there needs to be a sole focus on that issue at this moment in time. I think that there are allies across the board that need to be heard. There's legitimate oppression issues, and there are legitimate alienation issues from Latinos and Asians and all sorts of other folks. But we cannot get to an honest discussion about that until we recognize this country's original sin and the original paradigm through which we view race and the race construct. It is undeniable. It is pervasive. It is systemic. It driven our politics for 2.5 centuries. And until we look at race that way, we can't begin to understand the nuance that emanates from that. You cannot equate the Mexican or Latino or Asian experience with the Black experience in America. You cannot. You can make arguments about the hierarchy of whiteness and Blackness, but that hierarchy is predicated on Blacks being at the bottom, and it always has. And until that is remedied, I don't think it's legitimate to start muddling with the issue until we really start coming to the core of that problem, that social problem. And now is that time.
And that's a great point. And I wrote Sunday or Monday. This is Wednesday when we're recording this, Wednesday, June 10th. And I wrote about, I've got the original sin in my own lineage. I have, one side of my family arrived here in 1650, and pretty much most folks that arrived at that time that came from Europe have that association in their family somehow. As Condi Rice, I think, said on Sunday on Face the Nation, Europeans and Africans came to the United States at the same time. The only difference was one was in bondage and one wasn't.
Right.
That was pretty remarkable to think about. Now, so we're about 140 days. I didn't count it today. 142 days out from the November 3rd general election. Will this issue still be around? The House Democrats have come out with a plan on police reform. The White House has given parameters, and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has delegated to Senator Tim Scott, the only African American Senate Republican, to craft a Senate plan. Will there be a compromise? Is it in either side's desire to find compromise before the November election? Or are we still going to be battling this issue? And if there is a compromise, can the Democrats do anything that won't piss off the activist class?
Well, I think I want to answer that a little bit differently. As I don't see policy as remedying this issue, because the issue is far bigger than police reform or reparations or affirmative action expansion or opportunity zones. This is far deeper. And again, the 1992 cycle, I think, is probably, hate to be the old guy going, I remember the 1992 cycle, but that's the one that's comparable. You had a Republican, obviously a very different Republican in George Herbert Walker Bush. The economy was soft and softening. And you had this explosion, which was largely Los Angeles, but it emanated in other cities throughout America. And that issue was a driving issue that really started to cement people. And of course, George H.W. Bush went on to lose that election to Bill Clinton. I think this is similar, but probably bigger by a factor of at least 10, maybe more. So I don't know what will happen on police reform. I think something will be done. I think it will be done relatively quickly. I don't know that it's going to actually have any meaningful effect in the change of voter behavior on this at all. I think something very significant shifted. And what that shift is we are at a moment in American history where the culture wars, which began in the 60s and caught fire in the 90s, are now being transposed into race wars. We are likening, and Donald Trump really expedited this, culture and race are becoming inextricable. And that's what became explosive with things like Colin Kaepernick, where he would take a knee during the national anthem. It would be a very different discussion if that were a white football player as opposed to a black football player. And that's just the reality of the situation. So when Donald Trump has characterized the other, what he's saying is, I'm questioning their Americanness at a time of dramatic racial transformation. And when you imbue that with culture, what you're really saying is America is a white nation. And that's the struggle the Republican Party is having, the death throes that it's in right now. But it's also a larger struggle that America is having, because I do believe we are a nation in decline. Part of us are a nation in decline, but there is also this nation being birthed. There is a new emerging America, which will be fundamentally different than any past generation. At that point of one dying and in decline, and one that is ascendant and being born.
Well, we'll wait and see what happens. It's going to be interesting. I think things are moving fast on Capitol Hill, and I think that they want to get something done quickly. But as you point out, I mean, one, it may be largely symbolic, and no practice will really be changed other than the non-use of the chokehold. But then again, there's been illegal or beyond reasonable force used that was beyond practice previously, and there's no indication that that's going to change. And we'll see what comes out, but it's unlikely that activists are going to stop taking to the streets. I just saw on the news, New York City, they're back in the streets today, for the 14th consecutive day or so.
Yeah, and the reason for this is really, I think, quite evident. What policing is the most visible intersection between these two worlds. But if we do believe genuinely that it's systemic, as I do, we're talking about housing policy, education policy, which is an enormous part of this, environmental policy. It's a lot of public policy that we have enshrined in our society, and policing is the most visible because it's the most confrontational, the most violent. Video phones are ubiquitous. Of course, I'm not castigating all police officers. I'm just saying it's the most visible in its violent form, this clash. You don't think of environmental policy being violent, although a lot of it is very racist. You don't think about housing policy that is violent, but it is very racist. And so all of this systemic problem bubbles up at the point where it's most visible on camera and the most violent interactions occur. And so I think that there's going to be a lot of energy focused on that, but I don't believe that this is about policing. Policing is a part of it, but what makes it foundationally different than what happened in post-1992, the Rodney King era, is there's, I think, a genuine need and desire, and the political numbers, certainly on the American left, to drive a change, to transform parts of what society needs to be to accommodate a new country.
And when you dive into the experts that are talking about defund the police, they're talking about exactly what you're talking about, which is addressing some of the areas that are currently addressed by police through other functions of government. So not every time that you have a substance abuse problem is somebody sent with a gun and handcuffs and a baton.
Yeah.
But you could have a counselor go out. Now, I wrote the other day that, Democrats need to be concerned if this defund the police mantra continues, if they don't address it, because I think independent voters and even moderate Democrats could really get scared off by the concept of defund the police, even though nobody's saying zero out. Well, maybe the most extreme are saying zero out police budgets, but even the very liberal candidate that defeated my council member, Steve Hansen, in the March election, she's called for a $10 million redirection of police money. And that was the increase they were scheduled to get today. And another council candidate, Lee Simmons, down in the South area, called for the same thing. So can Democrats get out ahead of this issue with pragmatic solutions to basically disarm that issue for November? Or are we going to see ads of these signs that say defund the police, on TV come November or in our mailbox?
Well, you'll see both, but I don't think that, look, here's what's happening. The defund the police is very bad political language. The vast majority of Californians, Americans don't support defunding or eliminating the police. What it is it's very flimsy language from a nascent movement that hasn't found its understanding on how to communicate quite yet. But as you pointed out, their point is, I think, not only well taken, it enjoys broad public support. And truthfully, I think that policing is going to change. The nature of policing is going to change. And frankly, it should. We should not be asking the police to be mental health counselors or people who are in riot gear or EMTs and police officers and, in charge of, social services. We ask a lot of our police officers. You can't be an expert in all of those. So when these instances happen, we shouldn't be surprised. We do need to change it. We do have serious mental health problems. This country is suffering on a lot of fronts. That's what homelessness is all about. That's why we have higher suicide rates than any other advanced nation. It's why we have mass shootings when others don't. It's why we have obesity problems. It's why we have poverty problems. All of these are symptomatic of a very sick society. And policing, again, has been dumped on because it is the focal point of the intersection of all the failure of all of these services. So I think the idea of defunding the police, while extremely poor political language, is speaking to a broader need to have more resources that fund services that prevent the type of policing that we're engaged in currently. And I think if the police leadership in terms of unions and chiefs are smart, and they are, I think California specifically will get out front and lead the way on that. And I think that we can do that. We should do that. And I think ultimately police officers and chiefs are going to want that. Law enforcement's going to want that.
So moving on from the protests and policing and talking about November, we've got the other crisis. We're reopening rapidly in California and across the country. 19 states have increases in cases, including California. We've increased of hospitalizations in California. Here in Sacramento County, we've had a quadrupling of hospitalizations in the last few weeks. We're reopening fast. We're likely to have, the White House task force members are saying we're likely to see a second wave, although arguably we're still part of the first wave.
Right.
And how much of a factor is this going to play in the November election beyond the actual practical elements of vote by mail, which we're going to get to? But from the political standpoint, we're reopening too fast. The majority of Democratic and independent voters, not Republican voters, but Democratic independent voters, believe that we need more restrictions or continue with the same restrictions as of mid-May. And Friday in Sacramento, we're reopening bars and movie theaters.
Yeah. So it's a great question. As I think I was talking to Carla Marinucci a few weeks ago, saying that there's no political consultant alive, or at least that I know of, that was doing races in the 1918 midterms. So anybody who claims to know what this is going to be doing is wrong. We've never operated campaigns in this environment. But there are two factors I think you need to consider. The first is the logistical one of actually having elections and what it's going to do to elections departments in terms of actually facilitating the processing, voting, and counting of ballots. And that's very significant. We're seeing some of that. Again, it's Wednesday. Last night we saw some of that in states around the country. The other part is the political aspect of this. And this becomes a federal issue, one that I'm obviously watching very closely for a number of reasons. But when the president is pushing to open as fast as he is and charging up his base to politicize the whole COVID situation, it's because his only chance at reelection, at least at this point, given the dynamics we have, is a resurgence in the economy, and he has to get the economy going. If he doesn't, he will not only lose, he will lose in a historic fashion. So he's willing to bank with people's lives, especially in red states and swing states, where we are seeing very significant pops in the numbers right now as we speak, in order to roll the dice and hope that the economy comes back to save his reelection fortunes. I believe that that's going to have very significant political impacts with his base. As we sit today, Trump is at a 39% approval with Gallup, kind of the gold standard. I know a lot of people look at the 538 numbers, rolling averages. I'm not a big believer in that. 39% is the bottom part of his frame. It's the bottom part of his range. And I believe in the next 5 to 6 weeks, that number goes lower. If he starts going down below 39%, you are going to finally see defections from Republican senators, some House members, and parties in blue states just completely disassociating because he then becomes an anchor pulling down their candidacies and threatening the control of the House and of governorships throughout the country. And we're about that close from it. So look, the economy, a lot of the economic impact people haven't felt quite yet because of the COVID impacts. We're going to start feeling that in the next 4 to 5 weeks. COVID rates are going to continue to rise. We are opening too early, as you mentioned correctly. We're not in a second wave. It's still the first wave that just kind of plateaued. And both of those are not good indicators for the president, because this is the beginning of the COVID situation in March and April is when his numbers started to crater. And there's every indication that will continue, because the mishandling of the situation is precisely what got us into this mess.
And the indications also are that even where reopening is happening, the jobs aren't coming back. Yes, we had a great jobs report last week. We had the data issue with Bureau of Labor Statistics. Should be a 16.3% unemployment rate, not 13.3, based on whether people expect to come back to work and that sort of thing. But restaurants are reopening and they're not bringing their staff back. And I've talked to several restaurateurs. They're like, you know what, we're doing just fine with takeout and the social distancing, and uncertainty. We don't know how to do staffing. We kind of like the model we have right now, because we don't know if we're going to order a bunch of food, put a bunch of people on schedule, and then all of a sudden have another stay-at-home order, which could come any day.
Right. Well, exactly. And keep in mind, restaurants are built around their floor space. They're literally built to how many tables they can accommodate. So just opening up, first of all, doesn't mean people are going to come in, which is what they're experiencing. It's not like everyone's like, okay, let's go out. There's a lot of people very trepidatious about going out. But even then, you have to have 6 feet distance between your table space, so the economics don't work. The math doesn't work. You have to figure out how to make it work as a takeout, and there's no question revenues are significantly lower from a takeout model than they are from a dine-in model. That's just the way it works. But beyond that, I was talking with some people in Florida today saying, things are looking good. We've got, remodel and construction going. And I was like, well, how are the flights? If you don't have travel, particularly air travel, that alone, shutting down air travel destroys the economy. That alone, that one segment alone, which is not going to be coming back anytime really soon. And the growth factor, the exponential factor of what that's going to do is considerable. So look, the economy needs to be, it's going to take time. There's just no way to get out of this within a month. This idea of a V-shaped recovery may affect some specific industries, but the key critical political constituencies that need to be ameliorated are not feeling it. And it's why just 48 hours ago, you are seeing Trump losing support of non-college educated white males. That is his base. That is the bone of Trumpism. And he's lost 10 points with them in the last 30 days. So his base is cratering. And whether or not he can hold on to that, we'll get into some of the whys he is or isn't. But that spells disaster for not just Trump, but for Republicans up and down the ballot.
Well, and on the economy, I believe the Federal Reserve came out today with a projection of 9.3% unemployment at the end of the year. Now, I don't know if that's based on the 16.3 or the 13.3, but no matter what, we're still talking about double what we were looking at, last year. That'll be with us at least at that level through the election. And I know what you're talking about regarding air travel, because I had a plan to return to Mexico City. I had a flight and Airbnb in September, and obviously Mexico is having a big problem as well. And people are like, oh, well, they don't take the precautions that we do. No, actually, they're locked down even more than we are.
Right.
And on the restaurant issue, I'd also note that the movie theater restrictions are 100 patrons or 25% of occupancy, whichever is less. Mm-hmm. Now, no multiplex is going to open up. No. I don't even know if Tower Theater is going to open up.
Right.
I mean, the economics just aren't there.
It doesn't work.
So let's talk. You mentioned both. We have the thematic issues related to COVID, but we also had the practical issues. So let's talk practically about the November election. Now, Governor Newsom has issued an executive order, and the legislature is about ready to codify it to provide that November will be an election where every registered voter will receive a ballot in the mail, like the Voters' Choice Act counties, like Sacramento, have done the last couple of elections. The world didn't end. And then have vote centers that are available for day of registration, lost ballots, that sort of thing. So we saw yesterday disasters in elections in some states, in Georgia, Nevada, to think of. And Nevada had a robust vote by mail system. They had vote centers, but they didn't have enough vote centers. 3 in Las Vegas, 1 in Reno, I've been told. Los Angeles had that problem in March.
Exactly.
Are we ready for November?
No, we're not. No, and I don't think very many states are. But look, because we're in a heightened partisan environment, and I'm not making excuses for anybody here, but a lot of what you saw yesterday was a function of expanded vote by mail programs and the consolidation of vote centers. I'm a supporter of both of those. I'm a very big supporter of vote by mail, and I'm increasingly confident in vote centers as a way to make things work. But let's be very clear. We saw a fiasco in Los Angeles County in March 3rd. That wasn't because Republicans were voter suppressing anybody in Los Angeles County, shutting systems down. There were people waiting 3, 4, 5 hours in line up until 2 in the morning trying to vote down in Whittier, okay? And people leaving and not being able to vote. That's a problem. It's a systemic problem. It's not a partisan problem. And part of getting to a solution quickly is addressing it that way and not allowing the partisanship to get into it, because it's a very big problem. And no, we're not ready for it. I'm not an expert on the actual processes and logistics of counting votes, although I've spent many a first Tuesday in November night at vote count centers for the past 20 years. They're all very professional people, very well-intentioned and extremely sophisticated in what they do. But in California specifically, we allow for a very expansive manner of voting, and each one requires a different process. And I'm not critical of that at all. I'm a big supporter of that. But it's going to take time to count those votes when you do it that way. It just is. And we've got to be ready for that. We were not ready, especially in Los Angeles County in March. November is going to be a far, far bigger turnout, barring some pandemic or some other disaster. But no, we're not ready. And most of these other states who don't have near the experience that we do aren't ready either. And my big fear, and we're talking about this nationally with some groups, the chaos that will invariably ensue is going to allow for extraordinary input from either the president or external forces to say that there was outside influence or inside influence messing with the integrity of our elections. Most of it will not be true, but it seeds that environment. And that's why I have been so critical of Dean Logan, who's a great professional, but we weren't ready in March, and he acknowledged it. We were not ready. It was a fiasco. And until we are ready for it, and if we're not ready for it, then our registrars need to tell us. When we do not handle the processing of elections smoothly and efficiently, it lends the idea of the integrity of our system. The integrity of our system becomes challenged. We are already in a heightened partisan environment. We've got politicians unfairly castigating the process. When we do things that reinforce that, it undermines our democratic institution itself. And I will not accept that it's okay just because I'm a Democrat. I will trust Los Angeles County because they're better, or because I'm a Republican, I'm good with it in Montgomery, Alabama. I reject that. There are failures on both sides. They're not partisan. And we've got to be committed as Americans to our electoral systems.
Well, in normal years, it takes about 30 days for the full canvassing, the vote counting to be done and reports submitted to the Secretary of State. That was extended by 3 weeks in March, so 51 days.
Yeah.
November, as you mentioned, is going to be much more significant. And I mean, some people go, oh, why does it take longer? Well, if you have a warehouse and you have to space out workers that are literally opening up, verifying signatures on absentee ballots and spacing them out, that's fewer people you can actually have doing the work. So, I mean, it could be I hate to say after the new year, but if it was 51 days in March, add 51 days to November 3rd, and you're in late December, and it could be even longer in November, than it was in March. And I agree with you that just creates the ability to, claim fraud and, all sorts of things. I mean, ballot harvesting, ballot harvesting is, been used for a long time by both parties, as a phrase, as a word.
The allegations are nonsense, but they're going to be used to an extreme degree by both sides. Yeah. Look, I was running campaigns for Congress in 1994, and I remember being in Latino precincts turning out the vote. And, 3 hours before the ballots closed, I think it was Roy Romer, the chairman of the DNC, put out a press release on fax machine at the time saying that Republicans were suppressing votes. The Democrats use this tactic too. Okay, it's bullshit and it's nonsense, but they use it, and they've been using it for 25 years, and it's a lie, and it's wrong, and it's damaging. The Republicans have taken that to a whole new level, right? Of saying there's fraud with absentee voters, the undocumented are voting and stealing elections. Both sides are doing it, and it's starting to fray at the core of our democratic institutions because both sides lose confidence unless it's their person, their party, that is controlling the counting of ballots. It's an extremely dangerous situation. But again, the competency of government to handle these situations really bring into question and allow for a bigger vacuum of space for some of these conspiracy theories to take root. One final thing. As tough as 2020 has been, and I know we're only in June, the interregnum period, the time between the election on November 3rd and January 20th, if Trump loses, is going to be an extraordinary moment in American history. The margin, if Trump loses, he's going to need to lose by a wide margin, and he might, because if he does not, all of these allegations and all of these irregularities in terms of the counting, not that there will be fraud, but the fact that there is space for that is going to create a massive disinformation campaign designed to be a final push to upend the undercarriage of our democracy. And that's what causes me some great concern, and it's why, it's very early, but the fundamentals don't look good for a Trump reelection. He can absolutely win, but the worst case scenario is a close loss or a close victory, because it's going to be a very, very trying 3-month period on our country to see if our institutions can hold.
Well, and the other factor related to November that neither one of us have any insight into is, March 3rd election things were kind of normal leading up to March 3rd. We really didn't have COVID-19 in California. Then we had the May 12 special general elections in CA 25 and SD 28. And in those elections, we were under stay-at-home orders. So all of a sudden, get out the vote was all electronic or by phone.
Yeah.
And so if that happens in November, that completely changes, presidential general elections is when you get all of the activists out on both sides. Everybody wants to come and participate on behalf of their candidate, and they want to walk precincts and talk to their neighbors. That might not happen in November.
Look, I'm building a national political plan right now, and we have, for the first time, 2 political plans, because if we're in the middle of a second wave, which is larger than the first wave, there will absolutely be no door-to-door contact. There will be no physical contact. And as I mentioned earlier, California's starting to bubble up again from plateauing. A lot of these states are seeing their first real big rise. And so when we're talking about plans in eastern Pennsylvania, in Ohio, and Michigan, a lot of those states are seeing significant increases at this moment, and we have no idea what's going to be happening in October, November. But we have to have contingency plans, because we have GOTV plans that are designed entirely to have no person-to-person contact. And even if you did, in this environment, there was not a whole lot of person-to-person GOTV certainly wasn't aggressive in this special election than it was in the past, because people weren't comfortable opening the door and having a conversation about politics in the middle of a pandemic, understandably so. So it's making us re-examine the ways we can do voter contact beyond the traditional vote face-to-face contact, which, as we all know, tends to be the most impactful in a political campaign.
Well, and of course, in November, we're going to have congressional elections, and Republicans entered this cycle with a goal of flipping back the 7 seats that Democrats flipped in 2018. 2018 midterm election, generally Democrats underperform in midterm elections, but there was somewhat of a blue wave, if you will, in 2018. And Republicans came in, with a mindset of flipping all 7 back. Now, at least one's already fallen off the radar, and that's CA10, just south of here in Stanislaus County, where the Republican Party's abandoned their nominee over some racist comments. Right now, Real Clear Politics average, and we know polling averages, and the generic congressional ballot is what it is because it's a national number, but it's 8.2% as of today for Democrats, a Democratic advantage of 8.2. At this time in 2018, it was a Democratic advantage of 7.6. By the end of the cycle in 2018, at election time, the polling average was 8.4, and the final actual result was 8.6 for Democrats. So things aren't looking good right now for Republicans. Now, as you know, I often say that in politics, everything can change in 3 months. Right now, I think it's like 3 weeks, but or days. But things aren't. You still. I know that you have, and we're going to talk about your work challenging the president, but you're still a Republican at heart. Yep. And you've worked on Republican congressional campaigns before right now. Is there any hope right now that can be given to the Republican candidates for these congressional seats? Now, there's a spectrum. I mentioned CA10 has already fallen off. CA45 is a real tough one for Republicans to flip. That's Katie Porter in Irvine. She's become somewhat of a darling on Capitol Hill. She's close to Elizabeth Warren. But there's some others that are reasonably in play. So what are your thoughts given where the polling is right now? And why is the polling where it is right now? I mean, this is not COVID-related polling. I mean, these numbers have been fairly consistent all year when the economy was great.
So, first of all, anything can happen, as you mentioned. I mean, anything can happen. So it's hard to prognosticate. And there is a very, very, very long way to November. I mean, there's as much time from now to November as 5 months ago, whatever it is. We didn't know what COVID was. We didn't know what shelter in place meant. We certainly didn't think that the streets in our communities would be blowing up with race-related riots. So a lot can change and a lot will change. So that's why we look at the fundamentals, look at the baseline of what is happening here. And the fundamentals really, I think, are what caused the greatest concern for Republicans and the president. And that is, a couple of things are very anomalous. The first is we're starting to see a gap between job approval rates and reelect numbers. There's a persistent gap of about 4 or 5%. Normally, those are dead on the same. But Trump has a consistent job approval rating 3 to 4 points higher than his reelect number in the same polling. That's a very big problem for him because it means even if people agree with him, they're not going to vote for him. And that 3 to 5% is something that we've at the Lincoln Project have always said, if we get 3 to 5%, we're going to win, not just win the presidency. It's going to be an electoral landslide if you peel off 3 to 5% of the Republican base. We're now sitting at about 80. The president is now, as of today, sitting at 85% approval, which means he's losing 15% of Republicans. And it's coming from 3 different places, and this will largely explain the California dilemma for Republicans. The first is college-educated Republicans, specifically college-educated Now, Trump got 34% of white college-educated voters. It's a historical low, but we always knew that there was a softness with that voter group because there's a correlation between how educated you are and how much you like or dislike Donald Trump. The more education you have, the more likely you have left the party, didn't vote for him, or voted for a Democrat in 2018. California, in most of those districts, except for two, has a wide number of college-educated white voters. Even the Garcia seat now in Santa Clarita, that is white, suburban, college-educated, upwardly mobile Republicans who are not comfortable with the Confederate flag and the Confederacy and the race-based nonsense that we're hearing from the president. And that's why they've been defecting. And it's why you saw collapses in Orange County, in North San Diego, in North LA. The two that are anomalous is the seat up in Salinas area and the one in the Central Valley, because those are largely red looking on paper, and you don't have white college-educated suburbanites. What you do have is significant segments of the other two groups, which are 65 plus voters. Now, we saw, as you mentioned, the softening in the base, the Republican base, began with college-educated voters. It moved into 65 plus around mid-March. We started to see about a 10-point drop directly related to COVID and the president's response or lack thereof. These are the people that were getting hit by it. These are the people that were seeing it. These are the people who had friends that were dying of it. And they were looking at the president every day giving these press conferences going, this guy has no idea what the hell is going on, and he certainly doesn't care about taking care of the problem. And so for the first time in 3.5 years, that base started to fall. But there are two other groups that really surprised us. He started to dip amongst white evangelicals, which is his hardest core base, along with white non-college educated males. Both of those are showing softening. And the common thematic between all of those Republican subgroups is they do not believe that he has the competence to handle the situation that he has found himself in. Every president is tested at some point. Every president is. We are fortunate as Americans that his test did not come until 3.5 years into his term, because his competence doesn't allow him to handle serious situations. Had it come in the first year, like George Bush's with 9/11, or even Barack Obama's immediately upon taking office, we would have had a very different, as bad as it's been, very different 3.5-year experience. He is just now, in 3.5 years in, dealing with his first major significant crisis. He's failing upon every score level, and Republicans across the board are falling off because of that competency level. They do not trust him to handle serious issues. While everything was going fine, the stock market's blowing up, real estate values are going up, rates are down, gas is cheap. They could tolerate the fights with Kim Jong-un and the inappropriate banter and kind of, turn the other way when he'd say something racist. Now they're realizing it's a much deeper, broader problem about competency and governance.
Well, you mentioned the Lincoln Project, which you're working on with a group of Republican consultants, mostly many well-known folks that are challenging the reelection of President Trump. So why don't you share a little bit about the Lincoln Project, how you came together, and what you can tell us about the plans going forward?
So the Lincoln Project was founded by seven consultants, some names that are probably familiar to political people. George Conway, one of the best conservative lawyers in America, very involved with the Federalist Society, husband to Kellyanne Conway, president's advisor. Steve Schmidt, a name that a lot of Californians will know, who ran Arnold Schwarzenegger's reelection and John McCain's 2008 presidential race, and also handled a couple Supreme Court nominations successfully to get Republican judges appointed to the Supreme Court. John Weaver, who was Kasich's, Governor Kasich's, and presidential aspirant's campaign manager. He also did McCain's 2000 race. That's where I first met him in 2000. Rick Wilson, probably the best media guy. If you've seen any of our work, most of that creative stuff is the genius of Rick Wilson. Myself, Reed Galen, who's also another California hand, was involved with the Schwarzenegger administration, McCain work. Ron Steslow, our digital strategist, who's the millennial in the group, and Jennifer Horn, a phenomenal woman from New Hampshire, former chairwoman of the New Hampshire Party. It's the seven of us, kind of as James Carville calls us, we're on this pirate ship, tactically taking out Trump. And let me be clear to your viewers here, The Lincoln Project is designed and focused exclusively on taking out Trumpism. Trump, first and foremost, we're going to make sure he does not win re-election, but all of his enablers in the Republican Party. And the real goal is to exterminate nationalism from the Republican Party. As I say, I'm not trying to save the Republican Party anymore. I'm trying to fumigate it, because there are a lot of people that truly are nationalists more than they are conservatives. And this tension has really existed in the party since at least the Pat Buchanan days, when I was very young and still involved with stuff and the America Firsters. But it has now metastasized into something far greater, something much more dangerous. And so our goal is to make sure that President Trump loses re-election, and make sure that we have, if we aren't successful in that we have a Trump-proof Senate to protect the country and the Constitution from the executive branch. Ideally, we will expunge both nationalists from both wings of those branches and start the destruction of the nationalist element in the Republican Party, because it's a political anchor, and allow conservatism to come back in a more pure ideological sense, to have those discussions that I think are more appropriate for a healthy democracy.
So right now, the Senate Republicans have a three-seat advantage. There are 4 seats generally seen to be in the toss-up range. What do you think the outlook is on the United States Senate?
I think the Democrats are going to pick up the Senate. The question is going to be by how much. And we have been very aggressively involved and very successful in peeling support off of a number of Senate seats. The first ad we launched was against Cory Gardner in Colorado. Cory was down 4 or 5 points at the time. I think he's down 18 now, just pounding him. McSally in Arizona, I think, is down 14 points, 15 points. I mean, we're putting that race away. We launched an ad against Joni Ernst today in Iowa. The polls have her tied. We think we'll knock her down another 3, 4, 5 points in Iowa. Susan Collins in Maine. We're going after Susan Collins. We think we knock her out. We think we take Tom Tillis in North Carolina. We're running ads against. We're running ads against Mitch McConnell, which is kind of more fun than anything else. But McConnell's down 1 point to Amy McGrath. Now, McConnell hasn't been terribly popular in Kentucky, but he always seems to win re-election. But we're a very aggressive group, and we don't have a client per se. We just call our client the country. So we don't really have to worry about our candidates, political business. If we feel there's an opportunity, we just, get the posse together, put an ad together, get the data, crunch it, and go right at it. And I think that's part of the appeal and our success to this point. So I think that there's at least a 4 or 5 point pickup. I think Lindsey Graham is in trouble, deep trouble, perhaps, in South Carolina. And I think that Montana is a possible pickup for the Democrats as well. So you're talking all the way up to possibly 53, a 53 to 47 advantage for the Democrats, a complete reversal. Complete switch. Yeah. We think that's very, very doable, at least at this point in time. The numbers look very positive for the expansion of the map. One of the biggest challenges we're having, and again, it's very early, is building the capacity for a dramatically expanding map. You have to keep in mind, the Electoral College map has changed significantly in the last 20 years, but most specifically in the last 3.5 to 4. Ohio has always been the key state. You had to win Ohio, and you have since 1852. It's very possible for Joe Biden to win the Electoral College in a landslide without Ohio or Florida. So he doesn't need either of those to win. And the Democratic base, national base, is moving south. The Sun Belt is starting to dominate Democratic politics. Arizona comes into play. We think that Biden wins Arizona. Texas is much closer. I've been a critic of this for a long time because it's the Democrats' fool's gold. They've always been banking on Latino voters. The truth of the matter is Texas will go blue, if not this year, then in the next presidential cycle, not because of Latino voters, but because of white, high-tech, college-educated voters moving from California's high real estate market to Austin and Houston suburbs and Dallas and Georgia. And Georgia is much closer than people realize for the same reasons. Austin, Atlanta, Scottsdale, Phoenix all look very similar. They're becoming more affluent, more white and educated, and those voters are basically emigres from California or from the Northeast moving into these areas for real estate values and high-tech industry, and they're changing the politics of the South.
So for reference, when you went through the list on the Senate seats that you're looking at, I think the four that I referenced that based on Cook Political Report were Arizona, Colorado, Maine, and North Carolina were the four that they had in. But you're saying Iowa also may be in a toss-up territory at this point.
We think Iowa's a toss-up. We think Montana's a toss-up, and we think reaches will be Kentucky and South Carolina. Was Maine in your top tier?
Yeah, Maine's in top tier.
Yeah.
And Montana is Steve Bennett that ran for president, right?
Yeah, Bullock.
Bullock.
Yeah,
Bullock and Bennett, right?
Yeah, we think that goes Democrat, or has a very good likelihood to.
Yeah. Well, Mike, it's been a great conversation. We could talk for hours, but I think this is a good time to wrap it up, put a bow on it, and we'll come back in a couple of weeks, and I'm sure that some things will change, and who knows which way they'll go.
Who knows where we'll be. Thanks for the time, Scott. It's always good to visit with you.
Great to visit with you as well. Be well, my friend.
You too. Take it easy.